I came across a statistic this week that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. Canada's government takes 34.5% of the entire economy in taxes. Russia? Just 21%. That means Canada collects over 60% more tax as a share of GDP than Vladimir Putin's Russia. And before you say, yeah, but Russia is a corrupt authoritarian state, that's exactly what makes this comparison so uncomfortable. Because when you dig into the numbers, the picture gets a lot more complicated than anyone wants to admit. So let me walk you through what's actually happening with taxes in Canada right now, what you're getting for your money, what Russia's low tax model actually looks like in practice, and most importantly, how all of this is directly affecting your household budget in 2026. Because here's what nobody's telling you. The tax burden is only half the story. The other half is whether you're actually getting value for what you're paying. And on that front, a lot of Canadians are starting to ask some uncomfortable questions. Let me start with the raw numbers because they're striking. According to the latest OECD revenue statistics published in December 2025, Canada's tax to GDP ratio stands at approximately 34.5%. That's slightly above the OECD average of 34.1%. Russia, meanwhile, collects about 21.4% of GDP in taxes. To put that in perspective, for every $100 of economic activity in Canada, the government takes about $34.50. In Russia, it's $21.40. Over a $2 trillion economy, that difference adds up to hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. Now, the immediate response from anyone who understands economics is, well, obviously, Canada has universal health care, social programs, infrastructure, and a functioning democracy. Russia has corruption, oligarchs, and a war economy. You get what you pay for. And that's true, to a point. But here's where the conversation gets interesting. Canada ranks 13th out of 38 OECD countries on the Tax Foundation's International Tax Competitiveness Index. That sounds decent until you realize that means 12 developed countries have figured out how to create a better tax environment for both workers and businesses. The countries beating Canada include places you might not expect. Sweden ranks 6th. Finland ranks 7th. Norway ranks 13th, tied with Canada. Think about that for a second. The Scandinavian countries that everyone assumes have crushing tax burdens actually have more competitive corporate tax structures than Canada does. Canada's combined federal-provincial corporate tax rate sits at about 26.2%, 2 full percentage points above the OECD average. And when you layer on personal income taxes that can exceed 50% at the top marginal rate in provinces like Quebec and Nova Scotia, you start to understand why businesses and high-skilled workers keep eyeing the border. I want your take on this because I think it matters. Are we getting good value for what we're paying, or are we just paying more without seeing the results? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now let me tell you about Russia's system, because it's actually fascinating from a tax policy perspective. For over 2 decades, Russia operated with a flat 13% personal income tax. Putin introduced it in 2001 specifically to combat widespread tax evasion. The logic was simple. If you make the rate low enough and flat enough, people will actually pay it. And it worked. Tax collection increased 26% in the first year after implementation. For most Russians earning under 2.4 million rubles annually, which is about $27,500 USD, that 13% rate is still what they pay. There's no sales tax equivalent to our GST. Property taxes are minimal. The overall tax burden on the average Russian worker is dramatically lower than what a Canadian faces. But, and this is crucial, the Russian system is now changing, and the reason tells you everything about what low taxes actually cost. Putin signed legislation in 2024 introducing a progressive tax system with rates climbing from 13% to 22% on the highest earners. Corporate taxes are being raised by 5 percentage points. Why? Because Russia is running massive budget deficits to fund the war in Ukraine. In 2022 and 2023 combined, Russia ran deficits totaling 6.5 trillion rubles, about $72 billion USD. The money has to come from somewhere, and raising taxes on citizens is the most direct path. This is what happens when you try to run a modern state on a 21% tax to GDP ratio. Eventually, something breaks. So let's come back to Canada. Yes, we pay more. Substantially more. But what are we actually getting? Universal health care that, while imperfect, means no Canadian goes bankrupt from a medical emergency. A social safety net including employment insurance, the Canada Child Benefit, old age security, and the GST/HST credit. Public education from kindergarten through high school. Infrastructure that, despite complaints, functions at a level most countries would envy. And most importantly, democratic institutions and rule of law that protect property rights and enable business to operate without fear of arbitrary seizure. Russia offers none of that security. Russian businesses can be taken over by oligarchs with Kremlin connections. Journalists and opposition figures get imprisoned, or worse. The pension system that Russians contributed to for decades was partially confiscated in 2014 to fund the annexation of Crimea. So when you compare tax rates, you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing a functioning democracy with a social contract to an authoritarian state where the rules can change overnight depending on who's in power. That said, and this is where I think we need to have an honest conversation, the fact that Canada taxes higher than an authoritarian kleptocracy is a pretty low bar to clear. The real question is, are Canadians getting the value they deserve for the taxes they pay? Because here's what the data shows. Since January 2020, prices measured by the Consumer Price Index have risen about 21%. Wages have increased about 29% over the same period. By those numbers, Canadians should be better off. But that aggregate picture hides a more painful reality. Food prices are up about 30%. Housing costs, both rent and ownership, are up about 30%. These are the essentials that lower and middle-income families spend the largest share of their budgets on. For someone earning $70,000 a year in Ontario, here's roughly what the tax picture looks like in 2026. Federal taxes take about 14% on the first $58,523 of income, thanks to the new middle-class tax cut. Then 20.5% on income above that threshold. Add provincial taxes, CPP contributions at 5.95%, plus the new 4% on earnings up to $85,000, and employment insurance premiums. By the time you're done, somewhere between 25 and 30% of your gross income goes to taxes and mandatory contributions. And that's before you pay GST on purchases, property taxes if you own a home, or fuel taxes every time you fill up. Then you try to buy groceries, and you discover that a family of four is now projected to spend $17,571 on food in 2026. That's almost $1,000 more than last year, and 27% higher than 5 years ago. Is this the kind of return we should expect on our tax investment? I'm genuinely asking because this is where I think the conversation needs to go. Let me know in the comments what you're experiencing. Now, the government will tell you they're doing something about this. And to be fair, they are, at the margins. The middle-class tax cut that Prime Minister Carney campaigned on dropped the lowest federal tax bracket from 15% to 14%, effective July 2025. Finance Canada projects this will save individuals up to $420 per year and couples up to $840 by 2026. That sounds meaningful until you realize what else changed. CPP contributions have been climbing steadily. The maximum pensionable earnings for the first tier increased to $74,600 in 2026, up from $71,300 in 2025. Then there's the second tier, which covers earnings up to $85,000, adding another 4% contribution on that slice of income. Employment insurance premiums also continue to rise. The net result for many middle-income earners? The income tax savings are partially or fully offset by increased payroll deductions. A typical Ontario worker earning $70,000 might see their federal tax drop by about $250, but CPP and EI increases claim back around $200 of that. You're left with maybe $50 extra per month. That's not nothing, but it's not the relief that families struggling with grocery bills and rent increases were hoping for. And here's the kicker. These payroll contribution increases are baked in for years to come. The enhanced CPP program, which promises higher retirement benefits down the road, requires ongoing contribution increases that will continue eating into take-home pay. This brings us to the fundamental question underlying all tax debates. What is the right level of taxation for a society? Russia's answer for 2 decades was, keep it low, keep it simple, and let people fend for themselves. The result was low government services, high inequality, and eventually a system so fragile It couldn't absorb the shock of a major war without dramatic tax increases. Canada's answer has been tax moderately high by global standards, provide a broad social safety net, and trust that the security and services justify the cost. But trust is the operative word, and trust is eroding. When food bank usage hits 1.5 million Canadians per month and continues climbing, something is wrong. When nearly half of Canadians tell pollsters they feel like they're barely hanging on financially, something is wrong. When the middle class, which is supposed to be the backbone of the Canadian economy, feels squeezed despite working full-time jobs, something is wrong. The question isn't whether Canada should have higher taxes than Russia. Of course it should. Russia's model isn't one anyone should emulate. The question is whether Canadians are getting efficient, effective government services in exchange for what they pay, or whether they're paying champagne prices for beer service. And that's a question that doesn't have a simple answer. Let me give you some specific examples of where the system is working and where it isn't. Healthcare. A Canadian who develops cancer doesn't face medical bankruptcy. That's enormous. But the same Canadian might wait months for diagnostic imaging, struggle to find a family doctor, and navigate an emergency room with 12-hour wait times. The system provides essential protection at the cost of access and timeliness. Infrastructure. The Gordie Howe Bridge, connecting Windsor to Detroit, is a marvel of engineering that Canada paid $6.4 billion to build. It will improve trade flows and reduce border congestion for decades. But roads in many municipalities are crumbling, transit systems are overcrowded, and internet service in rural areas remains spotty. Education. Public schools provide free education through high school, and post-secondary education is more affordable than in the United States. But university tuition has still risen dramatically. Student debt loads are substantial, and outcomes vary widely depending on where you live. The social safety net. The Canada Child Benefit puts real money in parents' pockets. Employment insurance provides crucial support during job transitions, but processing times for many government services are frustratingly long, and bureaucratic hurdles make accessing benefits more difficult than it should be. In other words, Canada's high tax model delivers real value in some areas while underperforming in others. So where does this leave you, the viewer, in 2026? First, understand your actual tax burden. Federal income tax is just one piece. When you add provincial income tax, CPP and EI contributions, GST, HST, property taxes, fuel taxes, and various other fees, the total government take from a middle-income family is substantially higher than the headline federal rate suggests. Second, take advantage of every tax-advantaged tool available. RRSP contributions reduce your taxable income dollar for dollar. TFSAs allow your investments to grow tax-free. The new lower first bracket means optimizing where your income falls can have a real impact. Third, advocate for efficiency. The question isn't just, how much do we pay, but what do we get? Demand better performance from government services. Hold politicians accountable for outcomes, not just spending announcements. Fourth, plan for the future. CPP enhancements mean you're paying more now in exchange for higher benefits later. That trade-off may be worth it, but only if you understand it and incorporate it into your retirement planning. And fifth, recognize the broader context. Yes, Canada taxes harder than Russia, but Canada also offers security, stability, and opportunity that Russia fundamentally cannot. The grass isn't always greener just because the tax rate is lower. That said, acknowledging our advantages shouldn't make us complacent about our failures. The Fraser Institute's recent analysis found that Canada has one of the most progressive tax systems in the developed world. Newfoundland and Labrador has the second most progressive tax system of any jurisdiction they measured. Progressive taxation means higher earners pay a larger share. That's a choice Canadians have made through their elected governments. Whether it's the right choice depends on your values and your assessment of the trade-offs. But progressivity also means that as you earn more, the government takes a larger slice. For skilled professionals and entrepreneurs, this creates incentives to relocate to lower tax jurisdictions. And with the United States right next door, offering substantially lower rates for high earners, that's not a theoretical concern. Brain drain is real, talent migration is real, and in a knowledge economy, losing your best and brightest has long-term consequences that don't show up immediately in tax revenue statistics. This is the central tension Canada faces going forward. How do you maintain a generous social safety net while remaining competitive for talent and investment? How do you fund the services Canadians expect while keeping the tax burden from crushing the middle class? Russia solved this problem by providing minimal services and letting inequality explode. That's not a model Canada should follow. But pretending the current approach is working perfectly isn't honest either. The middle-class tax cut was a step in the right direction. The scrapping of the capital gains tax increase was a tacit admission that the previous approach was wrong. But these are tweaks at the margins of a system that may need more fundamental examination. So here's my question for you. If you could redesign Canada's tax system from scratch, what would you change? Would you accept higher taxes in exchange for better services? Would you prefer lower taxes and less government involvement? Or is there a smarter way to get more value out of what we're already paying? This isn't an academic question. The decisions being made right now about tax policy will shape your financial reality for years to come. The trade-offs politicians make between revenue and growth, between equality and efficiency, between present spending and future investment, will determine whether you and your family thrive or struggle. Canada taxes harder than Russia. That's a fact. But whether that's a feature or a bug depends entirely on what we build with the resources we collect. And right now, a lot of Canadians are wondering if they're getting their money's worth. What's your take? Drop it in the comments because this conversation is just getting started.